Good afternoon. I'm going to talk about subterranean life in arid lands, and I want to talk about the nature of subterranean biodiversity, where subterranean biodiversity occurs, what sort of habitats are available in Western Australia, and the factors that contribute to what you will eventually see is an enormous diversity of subterranean animals in Western Australia, a diversity that's only become apparent really in the last decade or so. I'm going to start off on North West Cape, which happens to be where I started working on this stuff. If we go to Exmouth town site, which many of you will know, this is based roughly around the Shire offices, looking north to the centre of town and south towards the War Memorial. Within about 5 metres of the surface here, there's a wealth of subterranean life. There's a cave fish, about 5 centimetres long, a shrimp, which has relatives in North America and Spain, amphipods, which are derived from the sea, another species of fish, a blind eel, which is the longest subterranean animal in the world, about 1/3 of a metre. These things tend to be rather small. Most of the crustaceans are in the order of less than 10 millimetres long. Another type of crustacean, which has its closest relatives in Canary Islands and the Caribbean, and an arachnid group, the micro-whip scorpions, who normally inhabit the underground or the leaf litter in tropical rainforests. That range, as most of you will know, is now very arid. So I want to talk about the sorts of places we find subterranean biodiversity. Typically people look for it in karst areas, limestone areas which have dissolved away by rock, and they typically go down great big caves and things looking for creatures that live there. Or if they're water filled, they go in other ways. This is a cave diver, cave range. But this is a typical section of a karst. You get landscapes where the water drains underground, forming caves, and eventually ends up at the water table. And the air-filled spaces get filled with some subterranean animals, and the water-filled caves get inhabited by others. Now, if you collapse this down to the size of a bath sponge, and the voids are perhaps 1 centimetre or 2 instead of massive caves, that's still a big landscape for these small animals. And so anywhere that you find cavities underground that have connected in any way, you are likely, almost definitely will find subterranean animals living there. This is an unlikely place to find aquatic subterranean animals, or even surface animals for that matter. This is out in the Yilgarn somewhere. Within a few metres of the surface there's a range of crustaceans, amphipods, isopods, diving beetles. And more than 800 species have been described from the arid part of Australia, roughly found in the last 10 years, and about half of them have been described mostly in the last 5 years. So there is a wealth of diversity there. This is not an oddball thing we're looking at anymore. This is major diversity. And there's also, of course, as well as in the groundwater, in the void space above the groundwater, there's animals that live in the terrestrial realm. So where do we find them? How do we get them? There are no caves through most of this country. So you start off looking down old pastoral wells, down people's boreholes that are kindly left open for us. We look in mesas. Some of you will know those on the way up to in the Ashburton Valley, most of them being mined now because they're iron ore. An iron ore mine. Pilbara, Barrow Island, very diverse fauna there. And you get smaller voids in the gravels that accumulate when the rivers fall off the plateau onto the plain. And this isn't a stable area like the others. This is actually a rather dynamic area, but it's got quite a good subterranean fauna. This is roughly the same site after a cyclone. This is the Fortescue River, and the site's roughly there. So this is a site that gets quite well disturbed at times. I want to talk now about the nature of subterranean animals and their adaptations. So we've got what they term troglobites, which are animals that live all their lives in air-filled parts under the ground. So their whole life cycle is underground, but they live in the air parts. Or steigobites, which are the same, the obligate subterranean animals that live in voids which are water-filled, such as groundwater or cave streams. I'll mostly be talking about aquatic things, but I'll do a bit about the terrestrial stuff as well. So they tend to be adapted in similar ways to subterranean life. They tend to lose their eyes, lose their pigment, and to compensate for this, they tend to have very long antennae or limbs or whatever they've got as sense organs. So they tend to be, and the legs tend to be quite long as well. So they have enhanced non-optic sense organs. And they tend to be convergent. These small subterranean aquatic ones tend to be long and thin. They can get through little spaces better. So these are quite different sorts of animals, but they're all long and thin, white, lost their eyes. The ones that live in groundwater are predominantly crustaceans, very diverse crustacean faunas. Insects haven't adapted much to subterranean aquatic life. Where you get the bigger voids, such as in limestone karst areas or volcanic areas, you get the bigger things. So you've got a couple of cave fish have been described from Australia. We know there's a couple more waiting to be described. In other parts of the world, you get blind salamanders, particularly in Edwards Aquifer in Texas. Some insects, they happen to be very diverse in Australia, and a number of other higher taxa. Subterranean animals in general, living in a low energy environment, so they tend to have convergent sort of life history traits. They tend to be very long lived compared to their surface relatives. They don't have many young. There's one little guy who's about a third of a minute long, has one egg at a time, and it takes about 9 months to grow. So similar sort of population dynamics to humans, really. They tend to have very low population densities as a consequence of the low energy environment. And this means that they respond quite slowly to changes in the environment. It makes them quite vulnerable in a conservation sense. So if you perturbate the environment, you can lose these populations quite easily. And the number of biodiversity attributes as well. One is you tend to, in the subterranean life, have a lot of what we call phylogenetic relics. This is where you've got few remaining species of once diverse lineages. So groups that in the past were very widespread are now restricted to the subterranean world in a few parts of the world. We'll have some examples of these later on. And we also get a lot of geographic relic taxa, so that is species that were once widespread that are now restricted to quite small areas. And they're typically what we know as short-range endemics. That is, the species is only known from a small geographic area. Commonly, a single cave, for example, might be the entire world distribution of a given species. This, of course, makes biodiversity conservation with these groups very difficult, very complicated. I want to give some examples first of some terrestrial subterranean animals, and I'll go on to aquatic, and I'll stay with the aquatic thereafter. Sorry. The left is the kitchen cockroach, the American cockroach that you squash commonly. The bottom right one is, and that has adaptation. It's got small eyes still, this one, but it's lost all the heavy sclerotization, the hardening of the body, lost most of the pigment. And this is the most cave-adapted cockroach in the world. It happens to be from Cape Range. Very long antennae, very long limbs, no eyes at all, quite translucent. The only hardened body parts are usually the mouth parts here, and in a male, the male genitalia. Here's a cave cricket. Everyone knows cartoon crickets. They've got really big eyes, and there's no eyes at all on this. This is another one from Cape Range as well. Plant hoppers, pests in the garden. They also go underground, and they live on roots that penetrate deeply underground. And they're even looked after by ants underground with also reduced eyes. Crustaceans also occur. Slaters occur underground. Very diverse, in fact, in the arid zone. Each patch has different species. And lots of arachnids of various sorts. Micro-whip scorpions. Some of you who came to a previous talk by my colleague Mark Harvey will have got a lot of these. Cave spider, eyeless spider. Originally used to cause trouble when we tried to find out what family they were, because 20 years ago, when these started to be found, eye pattern was still considered an important characteristic to determine families, but it's not used much now. Pseudoscorpion, this guy is Cape Range. There's another species in the Kimberley, close relative of things from Sri Lankan rainforest. And this was the opening slide again. This also occurs only known from a single cave, actually within the Exmouth town site. Millipedes. Now, this millipede is extraordinary. It's got enormously long legs, highly adapted to subterranean life. Looks more like a centipede. In fact, I've lent this slide to biologists, and they've used it in a talk and talked about the centipede. It is really quite a remarkable adaptation. If we go underground to the water-filled part, this is the cavefish. This is from Exmouth. Similar fish occurs, yet to be described, from Barrow Island. Amphipods, isopods. This guy is from Coolin Island, very extraordinary place to find on this in an iron ore deposit. And diving beetles. Now, diving beetles in the Yilgarn are a real speciality. Mostly, we find these things in ones and twos. Occasionally you hit the jackpot, and this is a single haul with a net out of a borehole up north of Meekatharra. And it's absolutely packed solid, full of diving beetles and amphipods. And there's probably a whole lot of microcrustaceans in that vial as well. That's a vial about this big. They're quite small animals. So occasionally, if the food, a lot of food there, this was an open bore, a lot of energy there, and populations can build up. But in general, they're very sparse, and commonly you'll go to the same bore, and you might go back to it and find nothing the next time, or you might find a totally different group of species, and you can keep going back to the same place over years, and you gradually accumulate more and more species from the same site. There's one bore in the Northern Territory where we've got the whole distribution that we know of is about 10 centimetres across, and there's 4 species of diving beetles that are only known from that one site. Now I want to go on now to look at the factors that are contributing to the subterranean diversity in the arid zone of Australia in particular, because it's really this region that in Australia we understand the subterranean fauna best, and it's gradually being extended. We've got colleagues working now in South Australia, which is also diverse, but it's really not been looked at much in New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, Tasmania. One of the areas that we've been working a lot on are these groundwater calcaretes. These are little shallow carbonate deposits that are associated with the groundwater flow into salt lakes. They're quite thin. They occur only in really arid areas, and they're about between 10 and 20 meters thick, and there's patches of them. One of the groups that lives there, this is a slater. This one is a species that lives in salt lakes. It's not where you expect to find slaters, on the surface, right across southern Australia from Victoria to Rottnest, being considered the same species. This is a subterranean one. If you go north, they don't survive in the salt lakes, and they've gone underground, and there's a great diversity of them. This is a map of this part of Western Australia, what I'd call the northern Yilgarn, and these lighter areas are the fossil drainage lines, very old drainage patterns. And on the surface of them you get these yellow spots, and these are the calcaretes, and there's lots and lots of individual patches of calcarete. And each of these acts as a subterranean island. They're like separate aquifers. And if you look at those isopods that we just showed before, each one has a separate species in. Not just one, sometimes they have 2 or 3 species. And this is true of everything we look at. It doesn't matter how big or small the animals are that live in these calcaretes. They're restricted each of them to a single calcrete. So each is a distinct community. The other thing that occurs in these calcretes are diving beetles. And diving beetles, literally by the hundred. We've got 101 species now. Before there were none known from Australia of subterranean diving. Diving beetles are very common. You see them every bit of water you get out. You see these beetles around the place. And they're quite big. They're typically very constrained on shape. They're very fast, hydrodynamic animals, big eyes, shooting around the surface and diving under the water. And they all look much the same as that. This is one type of diving beetle, and this is another. And these, the other type, they look quite similar. When they go underground, so all the rest of them are subterranean ones, and they go into all sorts of shapes which you never see on the surface. So rather than being constrained and going narrow and long and thin like all those crustaceans, when they've gone underground, they seem to have been released from this requirement to shoot around fast, so they've been able to develop all sorts of strange shapes for diving beetles, that is. This is a smaller area. It's a little patch here of the Yilgarn, and this is Lake Way, Wiluna. This is the Great Sandy Desert coming here. So this is right on the edge of the Great Sandy Desert. And there's a number of calcretes here, and there's an awful lot of mining sites here too. Those are all calcretes that we've looked at. There are some more calcretes. Each of those has a separate fauna. It's quite small. This is about the distance between Mandurah and Perth, I think. And even these guys down here, which are separated by less than 1 kilometre, have distinct faunas. Now, the fauna in any one of these isn't particularly great. Subterranean faunas aren't super diverse. They're not like the top of a tropical rainforest. There might be, say, 20 species, 30 species in total living there. But the species there are different from there. So if you've got 20 there and you've got 20 in each of them, in this small area, you've got 100 species. And this is one contributor to the biodiversity of the area. So if you actually...
Do they interbreed?
No, they can't. Sorry, I say that. We know this from molecular work only. We don't know whether they can interbreed because we can't actually keep these things alive in the lab. But they've been divergent from each other for 5 to 10 million years. So if you multiply these up, there's a great potential there for massive diversity. Another type of diversity that we get is, if you look at this, these are the old stable land masses of Australia. These areas that have been above the sea for 100 million years or more. This block, this here, has been above the sea for several 100 million years, and it's acted, according to all the sources, as a single landmass, which has never been below the sea in the last few 100 million years. And I want to look at two parts of it. There's the Pilbara and the Yilgarn, which I'll characterize just by those squares. And I look at the nature of the subterranean fauna between these areas. One of the groups we'll look at are these tiny little crustaceans called copepods. And the colleagues I had working with me described 43 from the Pilbara, 30 species from the Yilgarn. Only 4% overlap between those areas, although some of the sampling sites are really very close to each other. And these ostracods, seed shrimps, which are common in the subterranean waters in parts. There's 58 species described when this slide was made for the Pilbara. 5 from the Yilgarn, and there's no overlap between species at all. And if we group these up a bit and put them in genera, same things, the seed shrimps again, there's one genus only in the Yilgarn, there's 13 in the Pilbara, so there's only one genus in common between these areas. So this is quite a high level of organisation in the animals. And even more extraordinary, there's 17 genera of these Candinine ostracods known from Gondwana, basically from South America, Africa and Australia. Of those 17 genera, 13 are only known from the Pilbara. So the Pilbara is a huge centre of biodiversity for these animals globally. So it's incredibly important just for this one group of very ancient animals. So we've got diversity happening then both at sites, between sites within the area, but then you get a total change in the fauna between the regions in some cases, such as the Pilbara-Yilgarn. Now the reason for the difference in the Yilgarn-Pilbara fauna, I haven't a clue. Nobody's come up with a reasonable hypothesis yet, because many of these animals are very ancient, and there's no apparent reason why the Pilbara, which is quite geologically diverse, should be so distinct from the Pilbara that it's almost as though somebody built a wall there and nothing's managed to cross it. Now, another type of biodiversity I want to talk about is these relictual groups, these ancient groups which have survived just in a few parts of the world. I'm going back to Exmouth again, Ningaloo Reef, and down here in the air weapons range there's a hole in the ground, and it's a slimy cesspit of a place, and it's connected to the sea. It's a couple of K inland, still connected to the sea. This is the tide in the sinkhole, and that's the tide on Ningaloo Reef. So it's still some fluid connection, not above the surface, but underground. Cave divers go in there through hydrogen sulfide layers. And below it, there's a whole community, which is the only place in the southern hemisphere that these types of animals occur. They're all unique as species level, but the major groups that occur there don't occur elsewhere in the southern hemisphere for the most part. The most spectacular is this beast here, a thing called a remiped, and there's no common name. It's a class of animals. Now, a class of animals, so it's as distinct from other crustaceans as mammals are from reptiles. So it's a big, big group difference. This belongs to a genus called Lasionyctes. The only other Lasionyctes occurs on the Turks and Caicos Islands, which is exactly on the other side of the world. You see, absolute antipodes of Cape Range. I actually got my colleague in America was going to try and resample the ones in the Turks and Caicos so we could do some molecular comparisons. And she sent me an email and saying she couldn't actually find the site even because a Club Med had been established there since she was last there. And the next day I got a postcard from my brother who lives in New York, just having a wonderful time in the Club Med on the Turks and Caicos. You know. Another thing that occurs there is this group here. This is an order. It's the only occurrence of this entire order in the southern hemisphere. The order occurs Mediterranean, this part of the world, Caribbean, Quintana-Roo, and there's one species in Cambodia. This particular genus is known only from Cape Range and immediate environs, one of the Canary Islands and a couple of islands in the Caribbean. And this is typical of the patterns that we're getting with this particular fauna that occurs in the seawater part of these caves. So these caves have got that slimy top on it, hydrogen sulfide layers, and then below it you've got full seawater, so with that marine connection. And these guys are living in that part of it. Now, this fauna generally is considered to be what they call Tethyan. It's thought to have originated in the Tethys Sea, which formed in this part of the world before the supercontinents broke up. We're talking a while back now. And during the Jurassic, sort of, I don't know, sort of 100 million years or so ago, the Atlantic started to open up and the Mediterranean separated. And so the Tethys effectively extended into the Atlantic. Now, one of the hypotheses is, which there's some support, is that this fauna actually originated in the Tethys and migrated into here, because the center of diversity of these animals now is actually this region. The most pragmatic thing is that they actually evolved here and have emigrated out of the system. And until we get good molecular data on all these groups, which is a project that's just starting around the world, we won't be able to answer those sorts of questions. And the final two slides are another sort of discontinuity. We'll go back to calcretes again, but these are calcretes in the Pilbara, not the Yilgarn. And we're talking about Millstream and a calcrete immediately below Newman, a place called Roy Hill. We've got two species of this order called, no common name again, Speleographesa. So this entire order in the world has only 4 species. 2 of them occur in the Fortescue Valley. It was originally described 1,000 meters up in a cave in Table Mountain. And then it was the 4th species, which wasn't the 4th discovered, it was the 2nd discovered, was actually from western Brazil. And that's the entire global distribution of this order. The working hypothesis is that these animals were more widely distributed at the time of Gondwana, and that they've gradually separated on basically surfing on the continental plates over 100 million years or more. We're actually just starting to do some molecular work on all 4 species to see if we can get any idea on A, the order of separation, and secondly, whether we can get any indication of the time frame, because obviously if the DNA work suggests that these were only separated 20 million years ago, which would be very recent in these terms, that would refute this hypothesis. There must be some other thing. So, to conclude then, why is the subterranean fauna of Australia so diverse? There's a wide variety of substrates. The fauna has very varied origins. In fact, I think it has the most diverse origins of subterranean fauna for any continent. It's got aquatic fauna from marine, salt lake and freshwater backgrounds. And it's got clear links with both the Tethys and Gondwana, and probably Pangaea as well. So we're going back a long way, and we've got some very ancient groups here, some of which there's very good evidence now that they were subterranean at the time the continents broke up. So they've been underground for 60, 80 plus million years. There are some groups that have a global distribution where all members are subterranean, and most of these minor groups that I've been talking about, they have now no surface species at all. The entire species, the entire order is subterranean. The terrestrial stuff we've got, again, we've got good Gondwana connections, well-established Gondwana connections, and we've got stuff both from the arid zone, but most of the fauna seems to have gone underground at the time that the Australian continent dried out, so between 10 and 5 million years ago. Another contributor to the biodiversity is the very high turnover of species within regions, so that's like that area around Lake Way, where each patch of calcrete has got its own fauna, so if you add up all the diversity within the area, it is quite high. And the contributor to diversity is that we get a big changeover between regions. We know we've got big change between the Yilgarn and Pilbara. We've got some quite close connections, surprisingly, between the Yilgarn and the area north of Alice Springs. We've got lots of diving beetles north of Alice Springs, but there are no diving beetles in the Pilbara at the same latitude. and yet the Yilgarn's got nearly 100 species. You get to the Pilbara-Yilgarn boundary, there's no diving beetles at all north of that. And Australia also is probably the most stable of continents. It's a very old continent, which is why we have to supplement our agriculture with nutrients of various sorts and trace elements. There's been no glaciation in recent in my times, I mean since the Permian, so many hundreds of millions of years ago, there hasn't been a continental glaciation in Australia. And so this allows the accumulation of subterranean species through geological eras. So